Ek verwelkom nou twee gaste vir 'n gesprek oor Covid-paspoorte en ander forme van sogenaamde inentingsmandate. Martin Kingston is die voorsitter van Business for South Africa en sluit aan via Zoom. Martin van Staden is 'n regsgenoot by Sakeliga. I cannot use your first names, gentlemen, so Mr. Kingston, I'll start with you. We just heard from the taxi industry that they believe that a vaccine mandate will allow us to reclaim our lives as it was before COVID. Is that true?
Well, there's no doubt, Waldimar, that we need to increase the level of people who've been vaccinated. At the moment, we've got 35% of the adult population who have been fully vaccinated, 65% who have not, about a third of the level that we're seeing in Europe, where 75–80% of their total population has been vaccinated. We're on the cusp of the fourth wave, if it hasn't already happened. We're, I think, rightly and legitimately concerned about the possibility of further restrictions moving up from adjusted level 1. And we know that vaccination is one of the most significant interventions that we have against the virus, let alone the new variant of the virus. So certainly we think that if we're going to avoid the possibility of more restrictive measures, further lockdowns, if we're going to avoid deaths and indeed serious illness overwhelming the hospital system, then we absolutely need to take every step we can to encourage vaccination alongside all the other non-pharmaceutical interventions that we know we should be practicing. I have to say many of us have seen that it's not being practicing, whether it's social distancing, ventilation, or indeed mask wearing. And we've seen the numbers today going up to 16.5%. I mean, we are skyrocketing in terms of infection rates across South Africa, particularly, but not only in Gauteng. There's no doubt that vaccination is a very critical part of our armory of defense against the march of the pandemic across South Africa.
And I think that's widely recognized even by some who oppose vaccine mandates. Mr. van Staden, do you believe that life will go back to normal if a mandate is installed and our vaccination rate goes up as it might?
I don't think so. I don't think we have any reason to believe that that would be the case. The president in February said that there will be no mandates. He recently said that they are investigating mandates and that if more people get vaccinated, our social freedoms will return. But if the president was dishonest about there not being any mandates, I don't think there's any reason to believe the government now. I mean, not even other governments are doing this. You can see with Portugal, for instance, very high rate of vaccination. They're at this stage considering further restrictions. Gibraltar has 100% vaccination. They are considering further restrictions. And today, I believe, or today or yesterday, the Rage Festival was cancelled, even though the event itself had mandatory vaccinations, a mandatory PCR test to be shown at the door. So there was a vax mandate in a microcosm, and that was cancelled. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that lockdown measures will be relaxed, even if we have high rates.
I'm going to stay with you for a moment. Do you agree, though, that a higher vaccination rate is important to achieve?
I would say that personally, of course. I think voluntarily chosen vaccination and more widely voluntarily happening, absolutely. I think it's been shown that the vaccine is relatively effective against keeping people out of hospital, keeping people alive. But I think there's still a debate to be had about whether it's very effective against transmission of COVID. And that is, transmission is where it becomes relevant to talk about mandates. If it's not effective against against transmission, then it's unclear why a mandate would be necessary, because you could still have mutations in vaccinated individuals. So keep it voluntary, keep yourself out of the hospital. But then again, if you decide not to get vaccinated, that is fundamentally your choice.
Mr. Kingston, to you, do you believe that we've done enough as a society to share data and to convince fellow South Africans of the efficacy of vaccines before enforcing a mandate?
Well, we clearly haven't done enough because our vaccination rates are extremely poor. As I said, 25% of the total population has been vaccinated. We're now vaccinating about 160,000 a day. A week ago it was 120,000 a day. We've got capacity between the public and the private sector for between 350 and 400,000 jabs a day. We are way behind the curve. And we know, as my namesake Martin has said, that in truth, not only does the vaccine prevent, we think, to some degree transmission, but it prevents serious infection and, of course, death. And we must realize that we're not just talking about death from COVID. Last year, 89,000 recorded deaths in the last year and a half from COVID, 250 or 60,000 surplus deaths, we cannot afford for the healthcare system to be overwhelmed. And let us remember that is why further restrictions are put in place. They're put in place to ensure that the healthcare system can operate effectively by reducing mobility. Now, many of the countries that we know about in the Northern Hemisphere can function with appropriate support provided by the government. In South Africa, we've effectively run out of gas. There's no gas left in the tank to provide the support that's required to individuals and businesses that are impacted by the pandemic. Nearly 2 million people have lost their jobs. I mean, the jobless rate that was announced yesterday, absolutely horrendous and getting worse. We know that we're climbing out of what was already a recession in the economy, contraction of 7% in GDP last year, the worst performing economy of any comparable or peer country. So we need to take every measure that's possible. And if vaccine mandates or restrictions on access boosts the level of vaccination, then we think that that's an avenue that absolutely needs to be explored.
Mr. van Staden, to you, is this right to bodily integrity not one that, should in some instances be limited? And is this not one of those cases?
Well, it always has to be determined on a case-by-case basis, and I don't think this is one of those cases. The Constitution, Section 36(1), provides us a little roadmap for to determine whether there should be a limitation of any given right in the Bill of Rights. I don't think this comes close to that yet. I know Mr. Kingston earlier in August, I believe, wrote an article explaining that Business for South Africa was looking at partnering with local communities, with government, to encourage higher rates of vaccination, and that is what Section 36 of the Constitution refers to as a less restrictive means to achieve the purpose of a limitation of rights. And if it's the case that we haven't done enough sharing data to get more people to voluntarily vaccinate, then that must be our port of call. We need to persuade harder, I guess. But more than that, we have out of the United States now some therapeutic pills coming in the next few months, hopefully, that are effective at treating COVID, perhaps not vaccinating against it, but treating people who have been exposed to it and are going to be perhaps be hospitalized. So we have less restrictive means that are available to government to manage this issue.
Okay, but government seems to be, I'm staying with you for a moment, government seems to be moving in the direction of a mandate of sorts. How do you think this will be received by the public, who have shown themselves quite willing to be ordered about by lockdowns?
Yes, well, I think that luckily we have civil rights organizations, civil liberties organizations, and my own employer, Sakeliga, which are very concerned about this, and that will be taken to court. I can guarantee it. If there is a vaccine mandate, it will be challenged in court, and I think there is a very likely chance that the court would be sympathetic to the idea that a vax mandate is way too extreme, especially in a country like South Africa. And I mean, there's even something to be said for private business, private companies saying no jab, no job, in the words of Mr. Kingston, in this high unemployment rate environment, where I think the public and the courts probably will be less sympathetic towards that kind of drastic intervention.
Well, we'll see what the courts say. But Mr. Kingston, are there not other examples internationally of somewhat less restrictive mandates? Italy, for example, allows those who can show that they've recovered from COVID or who have a negative PCR test or who have a vaccine certificate to gain access to certain services. Is that not perhaps a little bit of a softer approach that might work here as well?
Well, it might work here if we had a higher level of vaccination. I mean, I think that the science is still evolving, as Mr. van Staden said, and even our own scientists are not necessarily aligned on every single aspect of the data that is informing decisions at the moment. We're in a much better position now than we were a year ago as a country, I would say, as a world. But the reality is that we need to use all of the levers that are at our disposal, not just the powers of persuasion, that's the most important one, working with social partners, civil society, government, organized labor, and business to persuade people on the merits of the case as to the benefits of vaccination, which, by the way, I mean, the data is absolutely clear as to the ability to avoid serious illness and death. The information has just come out of Cape Town, in fact, in the last 24 hours, which demonstrates that yet again. But what we're suggesting is that in addition to that, there need to be further positive and negative incentives. For example, the issue of opening up sporting facilities or cultural events to those who are only vaccinated. Now, of course, that impacts upon freedom of choice. I welcome the fact that there will be court cases because we believe that the sooner that there is legal clarity, the better. In fact, Business Unity South Africa has made it very clear that we're going to seek a declarator from the courts, hopefully as soon as possible, so that we can provide the reassurance as to what the legal status might be. And if it goes all the way to the Constitutional Court, the sooner the better, because the concern that I have is that we don't have the benefit or the luxury of time. If we'd have taken some of these decisions a year ago, we could have saved tens, if not 20 or 30,000 deaths as a consequence. And the same is going to happen now, as I said. We are confronted by a fourth wave. There's going to be a fifth and a sixth wave. I don't believe that in all conscience we can look back 6 months from now and say, if we had acted differently, we would have been able to save lives and livelihoods by taking decisions that might have been unpopular but were in the broadest possible interests of society, which is exactly what we're seeing playing out in the rest of the world.
Ons tyd is op. Martin, baie dankie. Bly ingeskakel. Na die handelsflitse gesels ek met Johannesburg se nuwe burgemeester, Dr. Mpho Palatse.